Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening at the Millennium stage for the performance featuring the Washington National Opera's preview of Cinderella. Now, please welcome Ken Weiss.
Good evening, everybody. Tomorrow night in the Opera House, just behind you, the Washington National Opera will open its production of Rossini's Cinderella, or La Cenerentola. It's a magical, sparkling piece, and tonight we'll give you a chance to hear some of the music from it, featuring members of the cast and the Domingo Cafritz Young Artists, and we'll talk a little bit about the plot and about how the piece came to be written. The first remarkable thing about La Cenerentola, or Cinderella, is that it almost didn't get written. It comes to us almost by accident, and it's a good story. Rossini, when he wrote La Cenerentola in 1817, he was 25 years old. His career was just taken off. But to make a living, he had to take jobs everywhere. He had commissions for this theater and that theater and the other theater. He was always running behind. He had a commission in 1817 to write an opera for a theater in Rome called the Teatro Valle, and it was supposed to open the day after Christmas. That's the beginning of the carnival season. But he was running behind, and then disaster struck. When you put on an opera in the 19th century in Italy, you didn't just have to get the theater owner to buy into it. You had to get it past the censors. The censors were always watching to make sure you didn't put on anything that was politically or morally dangerous. Now, Rossini was going to write a piece called Ninetta at Court, which was based on a pretty risque French comedy. And at the last moment, the censors told him he couldn't do it. So now he's got no libretto. So, 2 days before Christmas, there's an emergency meeting, Rossini's rooms. Rossini's there, and he calls in a librettist, a poet named Jacopo Ferretti, and the theater manager. And they're going through all the possible pieces they could write. They go through dozens of them, and finally it's getting very, very late. And the poet says, almost in a daze, well, there's Cinderella. And Rossini, so the poet says, was sitting in bed, because that's where he did his best thinking. And he sat straight up and he said, do you think you could write me a Cinderella? And the poet said, do you think you could put one to music? And Rossini said, get me an outline in the morning, after which he pulled the covers up over his head and went directly to sleep. And the poet went home and started working. In the event, they got it done in just about a month. It opened on January the 25th. He has to do some shortcutting in order to get it done that quickly. He has to borrow some music from other operas, for example, and Ferretti has to lean heavily on other Cinderella operas. This wasn't the only one in order to develop the libretto, and we'll talk more about that later. We're going to start tonight's performance by meeting Cinderella. Now, you know that's not her real name. She has a real name in the show, Angiolina, which means little angel. And they were going to call the show Angiolina or Goodness Triumphant. But the censors stepping in again, because there was a very famous Roman lady of very dubious virtue at the time. And her name was Angiolina, and the censor said, you can't call an opera that. So she became Cenerentola. Ceneri in Italian means ashes. So Cenerentola is the girl who lives among the ashes. And of course, if you translate ashes to cinders in English, you get our Cinderella. We're going to hear the song that Cinderella always sings while she's sitting by the fire. It's a song of wishful thinking about a king who has to marry and decides to marry a girl just like her. We're going to hear it from mezzo-soprano Alex Romano, at the piano Joel Ayala.
Solo, son io
Okay, y'all remember that tune because it's coming back a little later in the show. Now, there are some departures in Rossini's version of Cinderella from the Cinderella we all know. The Cinderella we all know comes to us from a 17th century French writer named Charles Perrault. And you remember that in the Perrault version, there is a mean stepmother. Well, this is a comic opera, an Italian comic opera. So the mean parent is not just going to be mean, they're going to be funny. And in Italian opera, the funny characters are almost always bases. And that's what we have in La Cenerentola. She doesn't have a mean stepmother, she has a mean stepfather. His name is Don Magnifico. And he has two daughters of his own from another marriage, and the three of them all oppress Cinderella. Don Magnifico has a special problem. He is out of money. He has spent all his money. He spent all Cinderella's money, all the money she inherited. His house is falling down upon his ears, and he needs his daughters to marry well in order to save the family from bankruptcy. Now, Magnifico may be a buffoon, but in the beginning of the show, he comes out to announce that he has had a prophetic dream, a dream that announces the coming of the prince, as we'll see a little bit later. Here to sing you the aria of Don Magnifico from Act 1 of Rossini's Cinderella. It's called Mi rampolli femminili. Here is bass Valeriano Lancias. By the way, you can see the translations up above the stage, just as you would in the opera house, or on these little screens to the sides. And thanks to the crew at the Millennium stage for making that possible. And here's Valeriano Lancias.
Miei rampolli femminili. Vi ripudio, mi vergogno. Un magnifico mio sogno. Mi veniste a sconcertare. Mi veniste a sconcertare, mi ripudio, mi vergogno, come son mortificate, degne figlie d'un barone. Via silenzio ed attenzione, state il sogno a meditare. Mi sognai che nel fosco il chiaro, un bellissimo somaro, un somaro ma solenne, quando un tratto, oh che portento, sulle spalle a cento, sulle spalle a cento, gli spuntarono le penne, ed l'aria sciuppolò. Ed in cima un campanile, come in trono si fermò, ed in cima un campanile, come in trono si fermò. Si sentiano per di sotto le campane stindonar, din don, din don, din don, din don. Col ciciccio ciucciu di botto mi veniste a risvegliar, col ciciccio di botto mi faceste risvegliar, col ciciccio di botto mi faceste risvegliar, col ciciccio, 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 mi faceste risvegliar, col ciciccio, 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 mi faceste risvegliar, mi faceste risvegliar, mi faceste risvegliar, mi faceste risvegliare. Ma ad un sogno s'intralciato e quel simbolo è spiegato, ma ad un sogno s'intralciato e quel simbolo è spiegato. La campana suona festa, allegrezza in casa è questa. Quelle penne siete voi, quel gran volo plebi addio. Resta l'asino di poi, ma quell'asino son io. Chi vi guarda vede chiaro che il somaro è il genitor, il somaro il genitor, il somaro il genitor. Fertilissima regina, l'una e l'altra diverrà, ed il nono una dozzina di nipoti abbraccerà. Un repicolo di qua, servo, 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 un ribambolo di là, servo, 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 e la gloria mia sarà, sì sì, la gloria mia sarà. Fertilissima regina, l'una e l'altra diverrà, ed il nono una dozzina di nipoti abbraccer. Un repiccolo qua, un rebambolo là, un repiccolo qua, un rebambolo là, e la gloria, e la gloria, e la gloria mia sarà. Un repiccolo qua, un rebambolo là, un repiccolo qua, un rebambolo là, e la gloria, e la gloria, e la gloria mia sarà. Peritilissima regina, l'una e l'altra diverrà, ed il nono una dozzina di nipoti abbraccerà, e la gloria mia sarà, e la gloria mia sarà, mia sarà, mia sarà, mia sarà, mia sarà.
All right, let's meet the prince. This is another plot twist that's a little different from the Cinderella we usually hear. In Rossini's story, the prince has to marry because of his kingdom's laws. His father has died. If he doesn't marry soon, he loses the whole kingdom. His tutor, a guy named Alidoro, comes up with a clever plan. He says, you can't really go out looking for a worthy wife if everybody knows you're the prince, because everybody will suck up to you if you're a prince, right? So he switches places with his valet, a guy named Dandini. Dandini plays the part of the prince, and the real prince, whose name is Ramiro, dresses up as a servant, because as a servant he can inconspicuously observe everyone and see what they really like. Now Ramiro, the real prince, has come to the house of Don Magnifico because his tutor has told him that in that house there is a girl who would make him a wonderful wife. And he runs by accident into Cenerentola. This duet that we're about to hear between Ramiro and Cenerentola is a great example of what Rossini and his contemporaries looked for in singing. They weren't looking for a lot of power. What they were looking for is gracefulness, agility, subtlety. You'll hear it in the way that Cenerentola and Ramiro twine their lines together, how they move in perfect synchrony through all sorts of very, very elaborate runs, and how expressively they sing about their budding love for each other. So as Prince Ramiro, we're going to hear tenor Rexford Tester. As La Cenerentola, we'll have again mezzo-soprano Alex Romano.
amici. Nessun risponde. In questa simulata sembianza le belle osserverò. Non viene alcuno, eppur mi die speranza il sapiente Alidoro, che qui saggia e vezzosa, degna di me trovar saprò la sposa, sposarsi e non amar. Legge tiranna che nel fior de miei giorni alla difficil scelta mi condanna. Cerchiamo, vediamo. Che cos'è? Che batticore! Forse il mostro assonio? Sì! Oh, signore! Un sove non so che in quegli occhi scintillò. Un sove non so che in quegli occhi scintillò. Io vorrei saper perché il mio cor mi palpita. Io vorrei saper perché il mio cor mi palpita. Ferirei, ma non ardisco. Per vergogna e taccio intanto. Ferirei, per vergogna, ma non ardisco. E taccio intanto. Una grazia, un certo incanto, par che brilli su quel viso. Una grazia, un certo incanto, par che brilli su quel viso. Quanto caro è quel sorriso, scende all'alma e fa sperar. Una grazia, un certo incanto, che brilli in su quel viso. Quanto è caro è quel sorriso, scende all'alma e fa sperar. Scende all'alma e fa sperar. E fa sperar, e fa sperar, e Del baron le figlie cercò. Dove sono? Qui non è vero.
Son di là nelle altre stanze, son di là nelle altre stanze. Or verranno, addio speranze.
Ma di grazia, voi chi siete?
Io chi sono? Non lo so.
Non lo sapete?
Quasi no.
Non lo sapete?
Quasi no. Qualche padre non è padre, onde poi le due sorelle. Era vedova mia madre, ma fumato in cuor di quelle. Questo padre ben orgoglio, questo padre ben orgoglio. Qualche padre non è padre, onde poi le due sorelle. Era vedova mia madre, questo padre ben orgoglio. Sta a vedere che mi imbroglio, sta a vedere che mi imbroglio. Scusate, perdona, la mia semplicità.
Mi seduce.
Scusate, perdona, la mia semplicità.
Mi seduce, mi innamora quella sua semplicità. Mi seduce, mi innamora quella sua semplicità. Questa voce che cos'è? Questa voce che cos'è?
A volente la levante, si rompe tramontana, non con un solo istante, tutto tocca a me.
Quella gente che sembiante è una cosa sopraumana. Mi pare questo istante già più merito per me.
Addio signore, addio signore, venga, 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 venga. Ti lascio proprio
innocenza,
questo cuore più mio
amore, mi vola proprio il cuore, questo cor più mio onore.
Ti lascio proprio
innocenza,
questo cuore più mio
amore.
Ti lascio proprio il cuore, questo cuore più mio
Ti lascio proprio il cuore, ti lascio proprio il cuore, ti lascio proprio il cuore, questo cuore mio non è. Ti lascio proprio il cuore, ti lascio proprio il cuore, ti lascio proprio il cuore, questo cuore mio non è. Questo cuore mio non è. Questo cuore mio non è. Mio non è. Mio non è. Mio non è.
All right, you've met the real prince. Now let's meet the fake prince, the valet Dandini. This is the aria with which he makes his grand entrance into the ball. For this, his boss, Prince Ramiro, will be back, dressed as the valet, and Don Magnifico will be back with, for the first time, the two stepsisters. Their names are Clorinda and Tisbe, and they're played by Jacqueline Eccles and Deborah Nansteel. Dandini himself will be played by baritone Christian Bowers. Now, Dandini is being a prince for the first time, and he goes a little overboard with the fancy language and the fancy singing, as you will see. Here's Christian Bowers, baritone, to sing you Come un'ape nei giorni d'aprile.
aprile va volando leggera e scherzosa, corre al ciglio, poi salta all'aro, salta al cielo un fiore a cercare per sé. Fra le belle immagino e divino ne ho vedute già tante poi tante, ma non trovo un giudizio, un semiante, un poccon squisito per me, un poccon esquisito per me, un poccon esquisito per me, un poccon esquisito per me. Graziosa, dico bene, son tutte papà,
Bestia, attento, ti scosta di qua. Bestia, attento, ti scosta di qua.
per pietà quelle ciglia abbassate, galoppando senza la ragione, e fra i colpi d'un doppio cannone spalancata la breccia e di già, e fra i colpi d'un doppio cannone spalancata la breccia e di già, e fra i colpi d'un doppio cannone spalancata la breccia di già, vezzosa, graziosa, son tutte papà, malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra, malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra, malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra, malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra, malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra, tragedia qui nascono fra, ripeta qui di ciglia passate, galoppando sotto la lezione, e fra i colpi d'un doppio cannone malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra.
E mi guarda, sospira, delira, non vedo come scappo di già. E mi guarda, sospira, delira, non vedo come scappo di già.
Malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra. Malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra. Malfinita la nostra commedia, che tragedia qui nascono fra. Che tragedia qui nascono fra.
E mi guarda, sospira, delira, non vedo come scappo di già.
Cinderella goes to the ball. In this version, she does not have a fairy godmother. There's a preface to the printed libretto that's written by Jacopo Ferretti where he talks about why there is no fairy godmother in his version. He says, first of all, we're at a small theater with a small budget and there are no special effects. But then he said, of course, besides that, Roman audiences are very sophisticated and they wouldn't want to see on stage the kind of thing that you tell children by the fireside. So if not a fairy godmother, then who? Well, it's the prince's tutor. The prince's tutor is planning everything. His name is Alidoro. And the one magical thing about him is his name, because if you break it down in Italian, Ali means wings and Doro means of gold, wings of gold, which he is sort of metaphorically. So he gets her to the ball. Now, there are two other things that happen at the ball. They're a little different from what we're used to in Cinderella. First of all, she doesn't leave because her coach is going to turn into a pumpkin. She leaves because although she runs into the valet again at the ball, by the way, you know, in the Cinderella we know, she thinks she's romancing a prince. In Rossini Cinderella, she thinks she's romancing a valet. When she has to leave, she tells him that she wants him to know her as she really is, not as she is dolled up in a fancy ball gown. She says, you're going to have to come and search for me. Find me in my real life, and if you still love me, then I will be yours. And she doesn't leave a slipper behind. And there is a reason for this that has, again, to do with the censors. Remember the censors? In 19th century Italy, it was considered dangerous to public morals for women to show bare feet and ankles on stage. You know how exciting that can be. So instead, she has two matching bracelets, and she gives Ramiro one and says, search for me. When you find me, I'll be wearing its companion. Now, we're going to hear the aria that Ramiro sings just after she tells him that. She disappears, and he says, you bet I'm going to go and find her. The aria is called Si ritrovarla io giuro. We'll hear it from tenor Rexford Tester.
Principe più non sei di tante sciocche si vuota il mio palazzo. Oh no, miei figli, sia pronto nostro cocchio e fra momenti così potessi aver ali dei venti. Trovarla io giuro. Amor, amor mi muove. Se fosse in grembo Giove io la ritroverò, se fosse in grembo a Giove, io la ritroverò, se fosse in grembo a Giove, la troverò, sì, la troverò, sì, ritrovarla io giuro, l'amor mi muove, se fosse in grembo a Giove, io la ritroverò. Se fosse in grembo a Giove, la troverò, sì, la troverò. Io la ritroverò, io la ritroverò, 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 la ritroverò. Domanderemo, ricercheremo, ritroveremo, la voleremo, domanderemo. Dolce speranza, freddo timore, dentro mio cuore stanno a pugnar. Freddo timore, dentro mio cuore stanno a pugnar. Dolce speranza, freddo timore, dentro mio cuore stanno a pugnar. Voleremo, domanderemo, amore, amore, mai da guidar, ricercheremo, ritroveremo, amore, amore, mai da guidar, amore, amore, mai da guidar, amore, amore, mai da guidar, sì, sì, mai da guidar, sì, sì, mai da guidar.
Now, if you'd asked Rossini's contemporaries what he did better than any other composer, they would have told you that he wrote ensembles better than any other composer. The way he wrote ensembles was going to dominate the world of Italian opera for the next 40 years. Everybody, in some measure, was copying Rossini because he had a way of creating these tremendous, energetic, light-footed textures, both in the orchestra and in the voices. We're going to give you a great example. This is the great Sextet from Act 2. Now, what's happened just before this is that the prince, the real prince, Ramiro, has revealed himself to everybody else in the opera. He says, they figure out that he's not a valet, he's really the prince. Everybody, including Cenerentola. And he has revealed that he's in love with Cenerentola, with Cinderella, and that is a shock for Magnifico and Clorinda and Tisbe. And everybody is just bewildered, and they'll sing about it in a wonderful ensemble where they say, this is a very complicated knot, and the more I try to unravel it, the more tangled it gets. And so you'll hear from everybody that you've heard from so far, and Joel Ayau at the piano.
Siete voi, Francia siete, voi sorpresa, il caso è bello, ma tacete, ha più cervello, se silenzio, silenzio, che sarà? Che sarà? Questo è un nodo avviluppato, questo è un gruppo rintrecciato, questo è un gruppo, questo è un gruppo rintrecciato. Chi sviluppa più in sviluppa, chi sviluppa più raggruppa, chi sviluppa più in sviluppa, chi sviluppa
resta tenton per l'aria oscura e cominciò questo è un nodo avviluppato. Questo è un gruppo rintrecciato. E intanto la mia testa resta e comincia delirar. Questo è un nodo avviluppato, questo è un gruppo rintrecciato, chi sviluppa più inviluppa, chi più sgruppa più raggruppa, e intanto la mia testa vola, vola e poi s'arresta, tenton per la via oscura e comincia a delirare. Questo è un nodo, questo è un nodo avviluppato. Questo è un gruppo rintrecciato. E intanto la mia testa vola, poi s'arresta, vola, vola, poi s'arresta, incomincio a delirarsi, incomincio a delirarsi, incomincio a delirar, 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 delirar.
We're going to close today with the happy ending, the aria that Cenerentola sings at the very end of the show. It's called Non più mesta, which means no more will I sit sadly by the fire. Now, those of you who know the Barber of Seville may recognize the tune from that. Remember I told you at the beginning that Rossini was under big time pressure and he had to do some borrowing. This is one of the big borrowings. This tune was originally a tenor aria in Barber of Seville, but it found its way into Cenerentola, and there's a very specific reason. There was a soprano who did one of the second runs of the Barber of Seville, and her name was Geltrude Righetti Giorgi. And she was playing Rosina, and she liked the aria of the tenor so much that she grabbed it for herself. She insisted that she be allowed to sing it. And guess who became the first Cenerentola when it was ready to be mounted? Well, it was none other than Geltrude Righetti Giorgi, so it made sense for her to sing this aria. All you had to do is change the words and change the music a little bit, but she already knew the tune, and it was sort of a showpiece for her. And when you only have a month from the beginning of composition to the first night on stage, it pays to do what you already know. So, I want to talk to you a little bit about the uniqueness of what you're about to hear. You know, singers in Rossini's time were expected to ornament. They were a little bit like jazz musicians are today. You know, young jazz musicians today, when they're coming up, they train in playing, improvising over certain set kinds of changes, like a blues set of changes or the changes to I Got Rhythm. In Rossini's day, singers were trained to do the same thing. There were particular harmonic patterns, chord changes, if you like, that happened over and over again, and they were trained to, on the spot, improvise over those chord changes. That tradition of improvising, we know Rossini expected to hear that in his operas, because we have in his own hand ornaments written out for singers who weren't comfortable doing them for themselves. So the idea was, if you were singing an aria and you had a phrase that was repeated, the first time you'd sing what the composer wrote, and the second time you would improvise something new. That tradition went dormant for about 100 years or so, but it came back in the 20th century with great singers like Marilyn Horne, and today all sorts of great Rossini singers are improvising in their arias. So in a way, every performance of Cenerentola you hear is unique, not just because the singers' personalities are unique or because the colors of their voices are unique, but because often the notes they sing haven't been sung by anybody else. And you're going to hear a little bit of that as Alex Romano does Non più mesta for you. Before we get to that, I want to remind you again that Cenerentola or Cinderella opens tomorrow night in the Opera House just behind you. There are 8 performances through May the 21st. And a special event. Have you ever been in a performance and in a theater and really wished that you had a hot dog and a beer? We don't let you do that in the Opera House because the upholstery is rather new and we don't have slipcovers. But once a year, we do a simulcast in partnership with the Washington Nationals to Nationals Stadium, Nationals Park. And the opera is simulcast live on the Jumbotron from the Opera House, so you're seeing exactly what the folks in the theaters see, and of course you can have popcorn and hot dogs and adult and child-friendly beverages, and there are lots of other activities surrounding the performance for the whole family. So it's absolutely free. So we invite you to join us on May the 16th at 7 p.m. for what we call Opera in the Outfield. And now, to close our performance, let's have Alex Romano back with the whole cast. She's going to sing the final rondo from Rossini's Cinderella or La Cenerentola, Non più mesta.
non più me staccando il fuoco sta sola gorgheggiar no affundando un sogno un gioco il mio lungo un sogno un gioco